good afternoon. This session is called Trading as One. If you'd like to go to the other session, which I wouldn't like you to do, it's called Africa's Energy Solutions. It's being held in the other plenary room. We'll begin in just a few moments.
The other one's quite boring.
I think so. Starting it. A very good afternoon. Our session is about to begin. It's titled Trading as One and is going to focus on trade within and beyond Africa. My name is Nzinga Qunta and I'm so pleased to be moderating this discussion. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, the largest free trade zone in the world by the number of participating countries, connects 1.3 billion people across 55 nations with a combined GDP of over $3.4 trillion. Intra-Africa trade accounts for around 16% of the continent's total exports, and that's compared to 55% in Asia, 49% in North America, and 63% in the European Union, and those figures are how those blocks trade amongst each other. So, what impact has the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement had now that it's active? And how can African products become more global and Africa-owned? And finally, how can we enhance the trade of African products within the continent? To answer this, I'm joined on my panel this afternoon by Professor Haroon Borat. He's a professor of economics and director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. Ronel Stander is the Chief Executive Officer of Westgrow, and Stavros Nikolai is the Group Senior Executive at Aspen Pharmacare Holdings Limited. They're going to guide us through the dynamics of African trade, examining the balance between exports and imports, and identifying what's needed to facilitate more trade. Just a big thank you to all our panelists for your time today. Ronel, perhaps I'll start with you. Last year, exports from the Western Cape are said to have shown growth of around 8.9%, reaching a total value of over 2 billion rand. Just tell us about Westgrow and the work that you are doing in the Western Cape to facilitate trade.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So Westgrow is the official tourism, trade and investment promotion agency for Cape Town and the Western Cape. We're proudly South African, but our mandate is the Western Cape. We're publicly funded, but we have a private sector board. We are very, very well located between the nexus between government and the private sector. And in fact, we, on behalf of the private sector and government, we run a number of strategic catalytic projects. I'll just mention two of them. The first one is Cape Town Air Access, where we try and connect the Western Cape directly with the rest of the world. And we've had some significant success in that regard. In addition, we also have a program where we connect, where we invite and try and expand the number of cruise ships that arrive at the Western Cape. So we have a number of such catalytic projects, and those are co-funded between the public and the private sector. We also have a focus on the present and the future. So even though we continue working with the existing industries and sectors, we also do market development in the case of new industries. So for example, one of the big new industries where the Western Cape can potentially make a contribution globally is the green hydrogen space. And we work very, very actively with the companies that are able to generate green hydrogen. But we also take our companies into market to try and position what it is that we do. There's also a lovely local and international. So we are very, very active internationally. Last year, we conducted 93 missions into market, and that obviously cuts across trade, investment, and tourism. And we hosted 63 delegations from around the world. Mm-hmm. So anybody coming into the Western Cape will always touch base with us at Westgrow. And so we basically planted the Western Cape flag in 47 countries. So that's a very kind of easy way to try and think about what it is. So I suppose it's about taking the Western Cape to the world and bringing the world to the Western Cape. So that, in a nutshell, is what we do. And we measure our impact on the number of investment deals that we sign. We also measure our performance on the number of export declarations that we're able to generate. For those that are not aware, the Westgrow is quite unique in that we don't only look after trade, investment and tourism, we also look after the film convention. And we do a lot of work in the creative industries, and we also, on behalf of the National Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, we run the Invest SA one-stop shop. So that, I suppose, is our link with national government. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Prof, if we're hearing about the different trade success and the mix of areas that Westgrow works in, could you just give us the link between trade and economic complexity and the importance thereof?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nzinga. So maybe for this audience, seeing that it's cold and rainy, I'll start with a story, because the notion of economic complexity is probably not well appreciated. Mm-hmm. So I'll take you back to 1860. There's a guy called Richard Cheeseborough, who was a chemist in Pennsylvania. He used to visit the oil fields in Pennsylvania. Standard & Poor ran those oil fields at the time, and the US was the biggest oil producer in the world. He realized that the oil workers were taking the residue from oil and rubbing it onto whenever they had cuts on their hands, and it was healing their hands. And he looked at this residue and he realized, and being chemists, this is the Aspen area, not mine, that if you heat and you cool some things and you add a few things in, guess what he could get out of that residue from the oil? This grey thing called Vaseline. And so in that process, the capabilities that Robert Cheeseborough had as a pharmacist, as a chemist, he was able to extract from oil the residue to then produce at mass scale, bottle, export, send to the rest of the US, Vaseline. He built economic complexity. So what happens is this notion of economic complexity, which, and if I urge you all to go and look at the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity, the process of economic development is about building complexity from one product to the next. You go from oil to Vaseline, right? The US became the world's leading exporter of Vaseline. Nigeria today imports Vaseline still. Nigeria has not become an economically complex economy. As you move up the value chain in a way, you produce more and more sophisticated and complex products by moving to products that are nearby to the ones that you are currently producing and exporting. And so the idea, in simple terms, is if you're growing apples, make apple juice, right? And in fact, from Vaseline, you can build a pharmaceutical product space capability. The challenge we have in sub-Saharan Africa is that we found in our data that compared to, and some of the work we've done for Africa in particular, is that at same levels of economic complexity, manufacturing, particularly manufacturing exports for sub-Saharan Africa, are lower than for East Asia. Now, a lot of that is to do with, firstly, capabilities, so the ability to exploit and match capabilities. So in simple terms, Asia may have had the Robert Cheeseboroughs, whereas Africa doesn't. Asia may have the infrastructure, and I'll come back to that later, whereas Africa may not. But the other key component alluded to earlier, that you alluded to at the outset, is the lack of regional spillovers. So what you do need is countries that are neighbors to trade.
Mm-hmm.
Greater trade, right, enhances all sorts of knowledge and investment spillovers that will then produce and promote economic complexity. That's really the core of building a growth and a development path through complexity in terms of using tradable products as the base.
Yeah. So if we're hearing about economic complexity and the importance of it, when it comes to your sector, can you take us through what this term means for you, and also strategic trade, what it means for your company, the pharmaceutical industry, and the African continent?
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, and good afternoon, colleagues. It's not often that I hear or get a chemistry lesson from an economist, so I'm going to reciprocate and tell you a little story about economists. So in the pharmaceutical industry, we don't spend hours analyzing trends and these other things that economists look at. I know that if I'm selling more antidepressants, I know the economy is in a decline. Right? If I sell more of those blue pills, I know the economy is growing. So that's my retort to the professor, right? Now let me get onto the question that you're asking. A starting point for me is, of course, that Africa has the most disproportionate disease burden of any continent, anywhere in the world. And kind of before COVID, people outside of the healthcare sector weren't really that interested in healthcare and in pharma. I suppose investors were interested, but sort of the complexity of healthcare, it is a highly complex sector, sort of kept most people away. And they said, well, leave that up to the doctors and they can sort out things. But I think we saw the impact of what a pandemic can do to economies, and unnecessary lives and livelihoods were lost. And many parts of Africa are still haven't recovered from the economic impact of COVID. So I think for me that's a very good starting point. So if you've got the most disproportionate disease burden, but you're still importing most of your healthcare goods and services, there's got to be something wrong, because it's completely counterintuitive. And there's been various, you and I were in Madrid 18 months ago, and a whole discussion with this, with Gabby and the World Bank, with the WHO and all the rest of it. And, I always tell these, anything that starts with a world, whether it's WTO, World Bank, WHO, etc., I always tell them that the numbers never lie. And the facts are that Africa's trade deficit keeps growing year on year. Okay. So what does this thing of strategic trade mean? Partly what we try and do at Aspen, and Aspen has a market presence in 60 countries, so we're probably South Africa's most globalized organization, or certainly in the top 3, I would imagine. What we try and do is, our philosophy, our business ethos is twofold. Yes, we have a commercial operation, a commercial ambition, of course we do. We have shareholders to satisfy. But it's also about improving the quality of life and saving lives for us. So that means giving access to people that largely have an inaccessibility of healthcare and, in our case, pharmaceutical products. So that's what we try and do. So that's pretty much what I try and do. So when I go into these markets, it could be licensing arrangements that give access. It could be M&A activity. It could be distributorships, etc. I mean, that's the way we look at it. But just in conclusion, keeping with the thematic of today, it's wholly unacceptable in my sector that we have the most disproportionate disease burden, as I keep saying. And yet, if another pandemic broke out tomorrow, and I'm not talking about mpox, but if another pandemic, half the scale of what we saw at COVID, I can't say that we've made much progress.
Sure.
We might be on our way there, but if it hit us tomorrow, we would probably be in the same position we were 4 years ago, where the world shut its borders on Africa, shut its borders on South Africa, and there's only one solution, and that is we have to have our own capacities and capabilities. And if you have that, you get economies of scale, you become globally competitive, and you bridge the deficit that the professor was talking about. You increase your intra-trade. So that is what we're about, and that's what I do when I go out into these markets.
Yeah, Prof, if I can come back to you, if Stavros is talking about that disproportionate disease burden, lack of access to resources, how can trade be used to effectively contribute to poverty reduction on the continent? And what policies would be effective in making sure that the benefits of trade actually reach people who are marginalized and vulnerable?
Yeah, so I mean, typical of economists, the evidence is actually, evidence is ambiguous, right? So if you stand back and you just, you objectively assess the impact of trade, say, on poverty reduction, the channels are positive and negative, but I'll come back to why overwhelmingly, under certain conditions, trade will be positive for poverty reduction under certain conditions. But the positive impacts are known. So you get reduced prices, right? So consumers, particularly who are poor, and you can see it in the South African context, clothing and food prices come down with greater trade and therefore greater competition. That reduces poverty amongst consumers, increases consumer welfare. There's a huge amount of knowledge and knowledge spillovers and in positive investment effects from trade. So that's the clear one. You cannot doubt what I call, I always tell my students, the Salt River to Google effect. So if you live in Cape Town, you know that Renelle and I were talking earlier, at our age, we remember when Salt River used to have clothing factories. Some of you may remember that. But now you've got design and Google and sort of graphic designing firms and so on. Trade did that, right? Trade displaced clothing jobs, right? There was massive labor destruction replaced by Chinese imports, and many of those workers went into the informal sector. That does happen in the short run. So then I look for data, and that's what I'm after, because I know if you look at some of the sort of standard economic theory, trade must increase welfare. And some really interesting work done by another world, the World Bank, 20 African countries over a 30-year period, looking at the impact of trade on poverty levels, find that 3 conditions are really important. One is financial development, right? And in fact, the effects are non-linear. So if you look at domestic private credit as a share of GDP, if it reaches 18% of GDP, the impact of trade on poverty turns positive. So in other words, it's far more effective in reducing poverty. So you need financial sector development to reach a threshold of about 18% of GDP in terms of private domestic credit extension. A really important threshold point for Standard Bank, for example, right, in thinking about sub-Saharan Africa. But the second is education. So the linkages from trade to poverty reduction only work if you have capabilities. If you have a workforce that at least about 80% of the workforce have primary or secondary education. The final one is governance. Trade oils the machinery of growth and therefore poverty reduction if you have clear rules, right? If you have courts that function, if you have a government that is stable, if you have limited rent seeking. In the data, it shows very clearly that countries that score above an institutional credibility score of between 0 and 5, above 3, those countries do better in actually reducing poverty from trade. So those three elements, if they are present in a country, you see massive reductions from poverty through trade. And that, for me, speaks to the idea that, you know, it's one thing to sort of step back and say trade is everywhere and always good. It is conditional, right? And you need to keep in mind it's conditional on country factors being present. And the literature shows actually that these three are the most critical. Financial sector development, so that deals can actually happen, right? Education and governance.
Ronald, if we are speaking about you as an investment promotion agency trying to achieve some of these goals, but also success for your partners, how do you specifically support exporters from the Western Cape in entering new African markets? And can you take us through some examples of successful market entries facilitated by Wesgro on the continent?
Yeah, thank you very much. I thought that maybe I just wanted to throw out one statistic which is really insightful. If you look at intra-regional trade between 2016 and 2021, Africa's is 12%, Europe is 70%, Asia Pacific is 67%, and the Americas are 63%. So there's quite a lot of work that we as African countries need to do to facilitate that intra-Africa trade. And then I suppose you'll see all the results that Prof. Arun has spoken about. But very simplistically, we basically organize tailor-made outward and inward trade missions. So we take Western Cape exporters and we take them into markets. Every year we have a look at the data and we decide which markets would be the best and which products, of course. In FY24, for example, we conducted 60 trade missions, and that was across Africa, Middle East, Asia, and Europe and Americas. A big part of our missions are in Africa. Africa is a really, really key market for us. Our traditional markets has been USA, UK, and Europe. But over the last period, we've actually been working with Standard Bank to access the China market for Western Cape exporters. We're working to access the Middle East market and, of course, to grow the ASEAN market. So those are the three new markets that we're busy looking at. So that is one of the things, obviously, that we do. We also invite international buyers into the Western Cape so that we can connect international buyers with exporters. We run programs to increase the number of exporters. So we have a program where if an exporter is market ready, we will help them to actually get over the line and into the market. And we also provide coaching for exporters. We also work with Western Cape businesses wanting to expand into Africa. So we're very well positioned as a sort of gateway into Africa. But to supplement and to support all of that, there's a whole machinery. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about that. But one of the key things that we do is we leverage technology. So we're wanting to increase the scope, the scale, and the speed to market. So we have invested in something called the Cape Trade Portal, where we actively connect international buyers, because you have to have buyers to buy the export products, and to obviously have exporters, Western Cape exporters, which we also verify. Because we a government agency, our website, or the Cape Trade Portal powered by Wesgro, has got that kind of officialness about it. And we do invest a lot of money to make sure that the portal works well. You can disaggregate if you're wanting to, if exporters want to go to Japan. So it's also a resource. We'll tell you exactly what it is that you need to get to Japan. So it's a resource. So that's one of the things. We work with partners. So we are a partnership-based organization. And I just want to throw around some of the bank names. Standard Bank is a big partner of ours. Investec works with us on Cape Town Air Access. Nedbank works with us into Africa. So that's quite great. And we work with a lot of international partners. Right now, CBAM, which is the additional tax that you're going to be, I suppose, green tax is going to be charged to exporters. We've identified that as an issue. Our researchers will work on that. We will workshop that with the exporters so that our exporters know what's coming in terms of legislation. So I suppose that's a kind of policy and advocacy kind of role. So all of the markets, so the bilateral agreements between different countries, and all of the products that can go into market are determined by national government. So what we try to do is we try to make sure that the products that are produced in the Western Cape are also included in some of those bilateral agreements. The services sector is the sector in the Western Cape that provides 70% of the jobs. So we have not previously had a focus on services. We previously focused on goods, so kind of produced goods. We now have a team looking at services. We've done a research study, and basically we're also now taking service exporters into market. I don't know if you know, but in the Western Cape, we've got 3 of the biggest EdTech companies. One of it is Construct. And they designed right here from the Western Cape. They design courses for Harvard, for INSEAD, for Oxford. And all of that is happening right here from the Western Cape. And we're trying to get a grip on what some of that information means. Because our exporters typically, so the Aspens of the world and a whole range of other organizations, they've got the, I suppose, the financial resources to do what they need to do to export and get into the market. But one of the services that we also provide is that we have built a brand called Made in the Cape. And we aggressively, so Wesgro puts money behind that brand. It's a white label brand. And any Western Cape exporter can use it to label their products. But we're also very active because without buyers, it doesn't matter what you do, your product will stay here. So we also, every year we have something called a Made in the Cape Buyers Conference, and we bring buyers from around the world to the Western Cape. We had one in March, and in fact we facilitated 180 B2B markets, B2B meetings for exporters with big buyers, and we had buyers from around the world, that came and visited the Western Cape. So that is just some of the I suppose, what underlies those trips into market. So the trip into market is almost like the last part of what we do. There's a whole value chain that leads up to that.
Yeah. So we're talking about Africa Unlocked at the conference, and Ronaldo is giving us examples of how they're trying to facilitate entry into Africa. What effect do you think the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will have, that agreement, on the pharmaceutical industry in particular, both in terms of the opportunities and the challenges in the sector?
Again, I think the starting point here is, in my mind, what does the Africa Continental Free Trade Area mean? And for me, it means 3 things. Firstly, an opportunity to aggregate volumes on the continent, because Africa is, it's quite interesting, because a few years ago when you spoke to the Europeans and the North Americans, they tell you that Africa is just one homogenous market. Nothing can be further removed from the truth. Every single market and every single state and province in Africa has its own idiosyncrasies and nuances. And we've never really exercised the power of Africa. So we keep talking about it being a continent of 1.3 billion people, a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. And we saw and felt this during COVID. because 54 countries went to try and buy vaccines. And compared to the US and the EU, who were buying collectively, there was no ways they were going to win. It's a little surprise what happened. So first and foremost, it's an opportunity to aggregate volumes. And with that aggregation comes the opportunity to leverage market power. For an industry like mine, where we're producing, and we've got factories in Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, and we've got 3 manufacturing sites here in South Africa. So for us, the industrialization opportunity through aggregation, or put differently, pooled procurement, is really important. And if we crack pooled procurement, and it is a project at the moment on the continent, then I think we will be able to industrialize the pharma sector on this continent. Bridge that gap I spoke about earlier, lessen dependence on others, and then we'd be fit for purpose for any future pandemic. The second thing for me, because I said there are 3 things as to what the free trade area means. The second thing for me is tariff reductions. Now, again, and I'm sorry I keep referencing the pandemic, but that's kind of the thematic I've been asked to speak to. I remember very early on in the outbreak of the pandemic, so this was probably in about April 2020, Strive Masaiwa, the RCT entrepreneur, he was appointed as a special envoy for COVID by President Ramaphosa. The president was chairing the AU at the time. It was our turn to chair the AU, and Strive got appointed. And one of the very first things that Strive said to me, how is it that Africa has outsourced a volume of 1.3 billion population to India and China? He said, how is it possible? And he's right, and I didn't have an answer for him. I mean, I know what the answer is, but you're a bit stunned by the question, I guess. So why is that the case? Partly because we're competing against India, and India's got a number of advantages we don't have. The list, I'm not going to be exhaustive around the list, but look at their economic zones, the benefits you get out of that. I'm talking about accelerated depreciation schemes, soft trade loans, subsidized land, water, electricity, and tax breaks that, we just cannot compete against. So removing tariffs on the continent, which could average about 11% in my sector, will close some of that gap. It's not going to close all of it, because there are clearly other things we need to do, like a suite of incentives that are customized and tailored, but that's subject of another conversation. So that tariff reduction in terms of attempting to level playing fields is very important. And then the final thing is, and it's linked to the first thing, we cannot continue being a continent that exports primary products, raw materials, minerals. So we export iron ore for $100 a ton, or whatever the number is, right? I'm making up the numbers. But then we will import a phone that's got a microgram of that at 20 times the price. So when I was saying earlier that this is completely counterintuitive, that's exactly what I mean. And just lastly, on this point, this industrialization point, I think everyone in this room knows that Africa harbors 69% of the world's HIV infection rate. But we import 90% of the antiretrovirals. Now, you tell me that makes sense anywhere. Put it in South African terms, we harbor 16%, 1/6 of the world's HIV population. And the only company that's producing ARVs in South Africa is Aspen. And we could be producing a lot more. So those are, for me, those 3 things is the nexus I'm drawing to the free trade area. And I think if we crack those 3 things, you will see an entirely different continent in the next decade or 2. But it requires absolute focus. We've got to stop this thing. Sorry, this is the last story. I remember once visiting Senegal many years ago. And it was a time of African Renaissance, and President Mbeki was a president. There was great excitement. NEPAD was launched and all of these things, right? It's great, great excitement. So I go and see this guy as a distributor. He's in Dakar. And he says, oh, my brother, we have to buy from Africa. We've got to buy from you guys. Intra-trade and all the rest of it is going on and on, right? And then I'm flying out the next day. And I said, he's a doctor. I said, doctor, where are you off to? He said, no, I'm off to Paris. My kids both live there. I've got an apartment. And by the way, I'm going to buy product. So I said, is that intra-trade? The guy was squirming. So I'm just saying we can change all of that. Mm. But we've got to deliver on these three things. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Davros. Prof, you do extensive research on labor economics, poverty and income distribution, and it's so important to know what you are dealing with in order to deal with the issues. Take me through what the Standard Bank Trade Barometer does, what trends and insights come from there when it comes to specifically intra-Africa trade, as well as Africa-China trade that Ronald also spoke about a bit earlier on.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so I've been involved with the Africa Trade Barometer, or Standard Bank's Africa Trade Barometer, for about 4 years. I think initially it was to get their maths correct. So they were trying to build a trade index and the mathematics was all wrong and the Excel was anyway, so started there, but of course I sort of got involved, and they retained an involvement in a survey that today is going into its 4th year, and really, really important. And I mean this even from a sort of policy perspective, because it goes under the hood below the aggregate data that you see about sub-Saharan Africa. Firstly, it's 10 country based. And just to Stavros's point, it's not 50-odd countries. It's actually picking strategically important and economically stable countries that have some level of consumer welfare or some level of a consumer market to talk about, and therefore a supply side of an economy that functions. So you've got everybody sort of from Ghana to Kenya, of course South Africa's there, Nigeria, Mozambique, so countries that have a level of economic complexity, if you like, and economic activity that banks and other traders can engage with. Into its 4th year, as I said, but covering areas such as macro stability, trade issues, of course, governance, but all of it around the ability of firms to engage in either intra-African or non-African cross-border trade. Why it goes under the hood is because there are about 2,500 or 2,600 firms that are interviewed as part of this trade barometer. So we have the standard data that we download by country, so exports as a percentage of GDP, credit extension as a percentage, all that sort of stuff. But then that's complemented by actual interviews with firms, and firms that are sometimes clients of Standard Bank, but generally firms that are engaging in exports and trade. So that then allows you to get to firms that may not ordinarily feature in what I would call the macro data. So some of the results, really interesting, is of that sample of 2,500, 2,600 firms, only 12% are actually trading or exporters. 12%, right? So in any given market, if you can think on average in these 10 countries, if you go into that country and you look at the firm landscape, only 12% of those are exporting. But even more interesting for me is that of the 12%, 75% of them, of those firms that are trading within Africa. So it is the importance of using intra-regional and intra-African trade as the anchor, I think, as the foundation for trade with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
The third key result was that 80% of, in the last round, 80% of firms actually saw an increase in trade coming through for 2024, which is a post-COVID effect. So off a low base, they felt that revenue was going to grow. One finally interesting factoid is in the 2022 results, only 18% of these firms knew about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Only 18%. So if you think about this juncture between what I call the policymakers and all these grand sort of policy visions that they may have, and actually people who are supposed to be the target population, you've done a pretty bad job. The good news, big jump, is that the number is not 18% now in the next round, it's 44%. I still think abysmally low, actually. If you think about a trader, on average, seeing this as the mechanism to grow trade. Just a final few statistics on China, because I think China is a really important part of our story here. That China is without a doubt the biggest trading partner for all of these economies, both on the import and export side. And so exports, yes, primarily raw materials, iron ore goes, and processed goods come back in. That's very much the case, right? Why do they trade? Firms are saying, and so that's the textured detail you get from these surveys, is firms, and by the way, it's all downloadable and the data is even available if any of you really want to engage with the data. Why do they trade with China? It's because the goods are cheaper, quality is good, and the engagement is very efficient. Can't really argue with that, right? So it's not as if there's some sort of political economy reason that's often, it's simple, it's cheap, and it's easy for me to do this, so I will do it. I thought a really interesting part of what we picked up in the, apart from the usual sort of FDI flows that come through with China-Africa trade, is that, and I actually wrote this down as a specific number, is that China is now the leading trade partner with respect to investments in ports. That's a really important aspect. So 46 ports on the continent are actually owned or heavily invested by China. And I think as an entry point, if you think about trade and the infrastructure need for trade, China lies front and center with respect to sort of both intra-African trade and trade with the rest of the world.
Ronald, earlier you were speaking about making sure that certain ships come through the Western Cape. Prof is talking about the ports and the investments that are made there. We're often hearing that cargo needs to pass through European ports before shipping from Cape Town to Abidjan or Lagos. What steps do you think can be done to make sure that there's more direct freight routes between countries that's also going to help facilitate that trade?
Thank you. You know, it's so I suppose the sea freight is a very interesting area, and it is really a matter of supply and demand. And so at the end of it, the shipping lines make the decision about where they're going to travel, and it's really about whether there's a business case. So, for example, you know, a vessel coming from the east, and typically China heading to Europe, so the kind of east-west route, they will stop at Durban, the port of Durban first. So the big thing is about, you know, the amount of cargo that can be uploaded and offloaded. So there has to be two-way, there has to be imports and exports. So they're not going to be coming all the way from China and then dropping off things that they can't pick up again. So it's really, really important. So I suppose one of the big things is that we have to increase, you know, the number of exports that we want. So it's export and import. So it's that kind of two-way thing. But a very important thing as well is the efficiency. So if you're not efficient at a port, it detracts from the business case. So a vessel moving towards Europe, so Cape Town's usually the last port that they will come to. They'll pick up the perishables and then they'll move to Europe. And along the way back to Europe, they'll stop off along the coast of West Africa, where incidentally the ports are also inefficient, but because the volumes are so big, it kind of, you know, it doesn't detract from the business case. So I suppose two things: we need to increase the two-way trade, so it must be imports and exports. But very importantly, probably one of the only value propositions that we know that we have in Cape Town is that we need to be super efficient. So there's a lot of work that happens together with the Port of Cape Town to make sure that certainly the Port of Cape Town is efficient. Yeah.
I'd like to make sure that this conversation is also a two-way one, and I would like to open up the floor for questions. There's going to be a mic that's going to come around. If you have a question, please may you raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you. Let us know which company you're from and if there's a specific person that's directed at. I can see representatives from the Africa Continental Free Trade Area in the audience. I think my first question is to you before I open it up to the floor. Just your feedback about the challenges and opportunities that you've been hearing about and any solutions that we might have missed out on this panel. There are, yeah. You can just pass the mic there.
Thank you very much. My name is Nzinga Qunta. I am from the Secretariat, Senior Advisor on Private Sector Engagement, and it's a pleasure to be here, and the conversation has been very rich. Unfortunately, when we talk about the AfCFTA, it's true, one of the remarks that we get is that people don't know much about the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we know that it's the private sector who actually have to drive it, to own it and to drive it, because the policy side has been done, the protocols have been negotiated between the countries, the member states, and today when we talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area, we are actually talking about 47 countries that have actually ratified and agreed to the single rule book that they have negotiated in terms of trading goods, trading services, in terms of the promotion and facilitation of investments, in terms of competition, in terms of IPR, and recently the protocol on women and youth in trade, because we also understand that for this trade to pick up, it has to be inclusive. And when we look at the makeup of the African continent, of the African private sector, we know 90% are made of, constituted of SMEs, women and young entrepreneurs. And also we have the protocol on digital trade. So the policy, the harmonization has been done, but it's all about now utilizing the tools and instruments that have also been developed to actually operationalize this agreement. And I would like to speak to what Stavros actually mentioned earlier. He mentioned about 3 things, that we need to reduce tariffs. And in fact, when we look at the fact that, if we consider the fact that the trade has started in 2021, and today we are in 2024, I'm sorry, there is already dismantling of the tariff reductions that we can perceive from from the 47 countries that have already agreed to the agreement. And because of that, we, the Secretariat, we started a pilot test in terms of trading under the AfCFTA. So when people ask, are we trading, are goods moving under the AfCFTA, the answer is yes. Recently, we actually saw from Cameroon some 100 tons of aluminium that went to Algeria. Uganda, who produces, I think every year they have an excess of 2 billion liters of milk, have now started exporting to Algeria under the regime, so benefiting also from the preferential tariffs, so the reduction of the tariff barriers that we have. And so this pilot is moved from 7 countries to, today we are sitting at 30 countries, South Africa being one of those countries, Kenya, Egypt, Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria also coming on board in the next couple of weeks. So it is happening, but the information needs to be out there, and I understand that it's very important for the private sector to have that information and to be able to seize the opportunity. One important aspect also that is key in terms of industrialization, because we really want to add value, is the rules of origin, for instance. Before the AfCFTA, if one manufacturer in a country X wanted to export to a country Y, you will need to you will face different regimes in terms of rules of origin. But today with the AfCFTA, if you consider the fact that on the continent we export or trade around 5,000 products, 93% of those products have got agreed rules of origins. And this applies within the 47 countries that have ratified it. So that means if you produce in South Africa or in Ghana, you can export it, or you can go and establish another facility in another country, and the rules of origins will apply. So harmonizations of rules is also another important thing which is also being done, and you actually can access any customs economic operator, custom officials, freight forwarders can access actually the e-tariff book on the AfCFTA website to make sure that the intra-Africa trades, happen. So I think for me, the most important thing right now is to say, how do we make sure that the information is out there? But also from the private sector perspective, where do we find the market information? How do I know that my product is required in this country? Who has to compile that information, for instance? I think this is very important, and maybe the lessons from structures and organizations such as Westgrow can help, so that structured business associations can also provide that information to their members, and so that we make sure that the information is out there, especially in terms of the business, the market intelligence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm just checking if there are any questions from the floor. If there are, you may raise your hand and let us know who the question is directed at.
Hi, this is for Prof. My name's Peter from Zimbabwe. So Prof, you mentioned with regards to trade that sometimes it's not beneficial or it's detrimental if you don't have those three conditions that you mentioned. Does it mean, or is it more complicated than this? Does it mean that the other party in the trade is benefiting at the detriment of the one who's, let's call it, disorganized? So, for instance, Zimbabwe trading with China, Zimbabwe definitely doesn't have all those three conditions. Is China benefiting at Zimbabwe's detriment? And then secondly, if that is the case, should Zimbabwe just close its borders?
Sure. Prof, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, so in the case of, say a country like Zimbabwe, you immediately are on the back foot with respect to trade, right? So you're forced to, I presume the exports are mainly tobacco and a few other natural products. So there's already a binding constraint in terms of foreign exchange revenue, right? So that then forces you in a price discussion where it's known to the other party, right? That you're on your knees. So it's a very open and obvious discussion with a country like China, or a trading partner like China. I mean, you may have some sort of protection of returns, as it were, if the commodity is one in need. So particularly in natural resources, where the global price is set. But I think ultimately you're right that if you don't have those three preconditions, so mature financial markets or financial development of some level, an educated workforce, and governance that operates, over a 3 to 5 year period even, you're always going to struggle in terms of maximizing the gains from trade. And in a sense, yes, countries will always trade, but absent those three conditions, trade is going to not contribute to growth. Trade is simply going to be that sort of steady state, low-level equilibrium, if you like, that generates just enough foreign exchange revenue to then fund imports, not as part of any growth, poverty reduction, economic development, industrialization strategy. And I think that's the key point, right? So you always worry, well, trade's bad, right? So it's the Saltrova example. It's yes, but, right? So if you get those conditions right, the sky really is the limit in terms of trade. And you just need to look at the East Asians to see what's possible, right? If a country like South Korea that has the same population as ours, just remember that, same population, right, did what they've done to move from low to middle to high income status within 30 years, all on the back of trade. That gives you the sort of, if you like, the sort of example, the prime example of how to utilize and maximize the returns from trade.
Mm-hmm. Checking if there are any questions from the floor.
Thanks. This is one part observation, one part invitation. So I work in a company, a South African company that does, we import. So we're not really the ideal profile. Is this thing on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's better, thank you.
So we're not ideally profiled in terms of generating the kind of growth or activity that you're looking for, but we're nevertheless part of the trade equation. Professor Borat mentioned these three criteria. It seems to me that the problem, this is the observation part, is that there's a fourth thing missing, which is an infrastructural problem. We would love to import from the continent. Truth is we don't. Yeah. Ours is a fairly modest business, and maybe we're missing opportunities by the bucket load. Mm-hmm. But apart from the point that someone made on the panel about putting it out there, or maybe one other person from the audience made the point, putting it out there, what is available, we with an appetite for importing, with the capital to do the importing, with the possibility of generating all kinds of healthy activity, we think, and maybe in turn engendering export activity, I'd say we are, both in terms of trying to go into Africa and set up retail stores, and in terms of getting material out of Africa that we could sell, we're stymied by the lack of infrastructure. I'm not saying this is actually, maybe this isn't the kind of conference which is intended to concentrate on that aspect, but it seems to me to be a foundationally important aspect and a much overlooked or neglected aspect.
Thank you.
And it's an invitation. If people have got stuff, just come and say hello.
Okay. Thank you. Not sure if anyone wants to respond to that before I get more questions from the audience.
So actually that's a really important point, because so I had to be true to the World Bank study. So those are the three factors. The reason, it's very interesting, the reason infrastructure shows no relationship is because it's also bad, right? So when they take the sample of African countries and they look at ports, they look at water, they look at energy, they look at rail, road, all of it's terrible, so there's no variation in the data, actually. So you do need a heterogeneity in that. It's a technical point, but you need heterogeneity and variance in the data to actually show, oh, okay, the better educated country does much better than the lower educated or the better governed. But in fact, in our trade barometer, sorry, through you, Chair, through our trade barometer, so there's a score between 0 and 5. It's super interesting. Between 0 and 5, that firms are responding in terms of the quality of infrastructure, where 5 is brilliant and 0 is terrible. All scores for every single infrastructure are a fail, below 2.5, except for telecoms, which gets 2.7 on average.
Sure.
Everything else, including water, interestingly, water, electricity, of course, right, roads, rail, ports, all below 2.5. So in fact, you're exactly right. I mean, infrastructure is just, it is the fourth factor in the pure modeling. It doesn't feature, but exactly right.
Okay. Thank you for your input. Just checking if there's questions from this side of the floor. Right.
Good afternoon. My name is Aminu from Nigeria. Actually, maybe the panelists have already discussed. I did not hear you talk about the currency of trade, inter-African trade. Is that not a barrier in hampering the trade between countries? Because I believe it should be a challenge. Which currency do we use? Are we still, because most of the traders or businesses in Africa is still done in dollars in between African countries. And I'm happy that AfCFTA is here, so maybe they are looking at it. And also, do you think that the African banks should be able to put together a package whereby within African trade, there should be a seamless flow that does not need to go through the process of dollarizing that trade within inter-African trade? So this is my question to the panelists. Thank you.
Stavros?
Yeah.
Volunteering you.
Look, of course, I agree with you. I mean, currency is and exchange rates are one of the biggest risks, actually, on the continent. So let me try and get a little pragmatic here. If I look at, and the prof's right, I mean, Africa is really, we call it the big 8, because there are 8 big markets, and I can run through them. It's Egypt, Morocco, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, and Ethiopia. That's sort of in my world, those are the big 8, right? And I can go through each one of those. So Egyptian pound, devaluation, around 60%. Nigeria, the Naira, I can go through the list, right? And even Ghana has had its problems. Kenya, I was there a week ago. As the protest started, I was there. In fact, I was due to meet President Ruto because he's the pharmaceutical localization champion. They cancelled. Okay. It says, meet my health minister. And part of those protests, not only about taxing the young people, but it's managing the debt. And it doesn't help you when you get this volatility in the currency. So it doesn't help the country and the governments, and it doesn't help those people that are either exporting and or trading in those markets. So I've just mentioned 4. That's already 50% of the big 8 that I spoke about, right? The question then becomes, how realistic is it to de-dollarize? Now, in a different world, I sit on the BRICS Business Council, and we've had that same conversation. And unfortunately, it's not realistic, right, to set up your own currency in Africa, not at this point in time. Not with the level of deindustrialization that we're currently experiencing. So, settlement agreements in local currency needs to be looked at more carefully as part of the solution. I think it would be a bridge too far to say we're going to set up a common currency like the EU did at this point in time. I think we've got to, because, you know, Prof, we're talking about, you started over the 3 factors and we've expanded that to 4, which we're now including logistics and supply chain, courtesy of the gentleman here. I want to add number 5, which is execution and implementation. So the continent also has to stop talking and start delivering and implementing. So the policies are there, and Cynthia, my colleague, is quite right. The free trade area, the Secretariat has done its job. We now have to go and implement. You've got to build the country and companies' balance sheets, so that you strengthen the currencies and you don't have these vagaries of exchange control fluctuations to the extent that we are seeing. It becomes very difficult. You're trading in Egypt, and the poor distributor there is asking you for a discount because the currency's impacted him. And then while you're negotiating that, the currency dips another 30%.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the reality of the world we live in. And unfortunately, foreign investors are put off by that. Investors from outside the continent and investors from inside the continent. And this is what we've got to fix through industrialization, I believe. Thanks very much.
As we wrap up our panel discussion, I'd like each one of you to please leave us with a minute on your thoughts on opportunities, challenges, or what you think is the most important thing to remember when we're trying to trade as one in Africa. Prof, I can start with you. We'll get to Renel, and Stavros will close.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's so many entry points, but probably one thing to keep in mind is almost where Stavros started, which is, Africa is not homogeneous. But I think an extension to that is to say, just keep in mind that you almost have regional economic anchors, right? So instead of having this overwhelming sense of where does one trade across 52 countries, I think even the AfCFTA representative will agree that it is about 10 or 12 countries where you really need to use those countries, whether it's a Ghana, a Kenya, a Nigeria, South Africa, and so on, Ethiopia, as economic anchors to then begin a discussion around enhanced trade and intra-African trade across those 10, 12 countries at least, because the basics are there, financial markets, education, governance, infrastructure, to use and leverage in intra-African trade for growth and development.
Renel?
Yeah, so, we spoke a lot about the movement of goods. But it might be interesting to just reflect on the movement of people. You've got, the CEO of Dangote, he has to have 35 visas just to travel within Africa. And if you just also kind of add to that difficulty with moving people, you've got flight costs, you've got language differences, the high taxes, the challenge with certification. So we really do need to kind of take a breath in and, and really embrace each other, because I think that there's just too many restrictions doing trade. But having said that, there also are lots of opportunities. And when I was thinking about some of the opportunities in transport and logistics, the opportunities in travel, tourism, and hospitality, the African extractive sector, there's a lot of opportunities. If you're looking at all of the metals that are required for the just energy transition, then they're all in Africa, and we need to be thinking about how we better leverage that. information and communications technology, so ICT, lots of opportunity. So I think there are lots of challenges, but there are also lots of opportunities. And I love the theme of the conference. I think that we need to act as one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Stavros?
Yeah, a couple of concluding remarks, and I'm going to be rather farmer-centric in my remarks. So I'll sort of leave you with three final messages. The first is, I think the free trade area presents a significant opportunity to industrialize our continent. So if we carry on talking about these vast swathes of unemployment, underemployment, skills leaving the continent, you can't keep young people on the continent. Why is that? Because we don't have an industrial base. And you create an industrial base, you start sorting out backward and front linkages, up and downstream, and you start building these businesses, these smaller businesses. And what will solve the crisis on the continent is SMEs. So that's the first point, is free trade area, great opportunity, but then that takes me to my second point. And that is, we talk a lot on the continent. We need to start executing and implementing. And that's going to require further political will. It's going to require building capacity on the continent so that you can execute on the free trade area. Free trade area is great on paper, as Cynthia said, but if there's no execution on the ground because no capacity, then it's doomed to fail. So we've got to build a capacity. And then the third thing is a mindset shift. So what I mean by that, we've got to shed any notion of Afro-pessimism. Because it's interesting, there's some of the biggest Afro-pessimists around African-produced products actually sit in the continent. We've got to shed that mindset. And if you want a good news story to end off with, people said we could never do it in pharma. Okay, pharma is the purview and domain of the Europeans, North Americans, Indians, and Japanese. Well, today Aspen is the largest supplier of general anesthetics and muscle blockers in the world. And during COVID, the heads of state were phoning us for stock. So Macron and Edouard, the Prime Minister, and the Italian PM, they were phoning and saying, Aspen, please send us general anesthetics. Usually it's the other way around. Usually it's African heads of state begging and pleading for critical medicines. So it can be done. We've got to shed the Afro-pessimism, and we'll get there. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.
A wonderful audience.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. We're going to have a short networking break afterwards in session room 1. We're going to be talking about family businesses driving new investment dynamics. And in session room 2, Can Africa Feed Itself? Thank you so much and a good afternoon.